Hello, dear colleagues and friends and fellow thinkers. I'm Irina Prokhorova, the chief editor of NLO magazine, and on behalf of NLO magazine, I'm welcoming you at the 27th Bathhouse Readings, the annual conference that has been taking place under the auspices of NLO magazine since its very start, 1993. And the theme of today's conference, Anthropology of Violence, State, Society and Culture. I don't think we have to meditate much as to how this theme is important for the world and Russia now. I just want to note that we wanted to discuss this theme last year, but because of COVID, we had to cancel the conference. And this year, we decided not to postpone the conference anymore, and we would have it now. And so I'm welcoming you at our online conference. And of course, the theme of anthropology of violence is colossal. It includes a lot of themes. We will try to concentrate, or at least to indirectly discuss, the problems connected with the state violence first and foremost. How, in what way, and when state monopolizes the right to violence, how it uses it, to what purposes, how war influences the general state of the society, the increase of violence, and what political steps are being taken in this respect, and how society reacts to that. The second important circle of questions is the violence within the society itself, how it emerges and how the society uses violence to fight the society's violence, how the evolution of the society takes place and the regular norms of violence become unacceptable. And the third circle of questions is, of course, reflection and how culture translates the certain norms of violence and how it reflects them, how perhaps it deconstructs violence. And in general, a very important theme is how and when the norm changes itself, what makes society fight against the increase of violence, or vice versa, why it becomes mobilized and more aggressive. And of course, we cannot shed light on everything, but at least these topics are at the heart of our conference. And today we're having the first section, which is dedicated to state and violence. And I'm happy to present you the first speaker. It is Evgeny Blinov, Tyumen State University, and Institute of Philosophy of Iran, Tokyo, Moscow. And now he will be talking of state and violence from Tokyo, and his theme is the ways of terror from the emanation of virtue to absolute evil, the modern state, and the problem of legitimizing violence. Thank you, Irina Dmitrievna. Dear colleagues and listeners, my speech is dedicated to the problem of the state violence and the problem of terror, or reflection of the problem of terror in the context of the longer history, without which it is impossible to give any qualified analysis of such problems as terrorism and the problems of legitimation and delegitimation of state and non-state actors of violence. And as an epigraph, I would adduce the statements of our official Russian diplomacy, which often accuses our Western partners of double standards and asks for some final lists of terrorists and to adopt some general principles as to what is terrorism, what is the revolt of people, and what is the legitimate violence on behalf of the state. And this is not a case of regular rhetorics, it can only mean the basic misunderstanding of the West European political model. because this ambiguity is in a way laid at the foundation of the basic notion of the relationship between state and violence. And within the international law, we can also find the formulations that can seem self-contradictory, the collisions of international law, so to speak. Because on the one hand, there is, or we can find in the resolutions of UN the idea that state or international community must reserve people's right to revolt, the right to break down the tyrannical power. On the other hand, the resolutions of UN of 1994 states directly that terrorism does not affect the state's right for legitimate violence, and in this way, and thus we can say that this ambiguity can be compared to another juridical case, the contradiction between the right to sovereignty of the state and the right of people to self-determinacy. In this juridical discourse, we can find this contradiction, the right of people to revolt and the right of state to use legitimate violence. And I think that we have to turn to the classical formulations, first and foremost, as to understanding of the state violence as it was formulated by Locke in his famous second treatise on government, in his conclusive 2 chapters that are dedicated to the end of governance, the end of system of governance, where Locke specifies quite rigidly that tyranny is the execution of power outside the frame of law, and that society is not identical in Locke's view to governance, to the system of governance. And Locke, in his quite rigid juridical style, defines the conditions of termination of the contract between the sides. He says that the society is entitled to oppose power against tyranny when the governor steps outside the frame of law and doesn't act in the public interest. And Locke is doing without any Gobbesian anguish and pathos, Leviathan or mortal God. He's just simply, from the point of view from the juridical point of view, he shows under which terms the contract between government and the people, on the other hand, is terminated. And at the same time, Locke has the idea that both society and the state have the right to violence, to use force, but the problem of violence is not specified with Locke. And the next stage of our understanding of the right to revolt and the right to legitimate violence comes with the French Revolution. And the French Revolution confirms the right to revolt in the second edition of Declaration of Human Rights. And then when the Jacobinian government comes to power, its theoreticians, Saint-Just and Robespierre, they come with very important clarifications about that. And Saint-Just is saying that, of course, the people are entitled to revolt against tyranny, but not against republic based on the principle of sovereignty. In a way, people cannot revolt against themselves. And the moment we establish the republican rule based on social contract and the principles formulated by Locke and Rousseau, this right to revolt is not indefeasible anymore. And Robespierre makes a further step in his famous speech on the 5th of February of 1794 on the principles of political morality. He says that the state can use terror as a sound means of insurance of revolutionary justice. And in a certain way, for Robespierre, the state terror is the means against the abuse of right to revolt. There is such a term, abuse, introduced by Locke, which is now experiencing the second revival now. And Robespierre was showing that terror is emanation of virtue, and I'm quoting Robespierre, it's a small quotation, that if in the times of peace the driving force of government is virtue, then in the revolutionary period it's both virtue and terror. Virtue without which terror is deathly, terror without which virtue is powerless. Terror is nothing else but quick, strict and uncompromising justice. And it is thus emanation of virtue. It is not just a lesser principle as a conclusion from the bigger principle of democracy used for the necessities of our motherland. They say that terror is the instrument. They say that terror is a power in the hands of despotic government. But is your government similar to despotism? Yes, just like the sword glimmering in the hands of the heroes of freedom is similar to the swords in the hands of the slaves of tyranny. The fact that tyrant is using terror against his slave-like people makes him right in him being a tyrant. If you subdue the enemies of freedom with terror, you will be the founder of republic. Revolutionary government is despotism of freedom against tyranny. Wasn't power itself created to gratify crime rather than to give a blow to arrogance? Robespierre asks in his rhetorical manner. And Robespierre states specifically, I remind you that Saint-Just and Robespierre were lawyers by profession. They both explain that the special proceeding of court-martials, they help the revolutionary justice, because if, Robespierre says, if we observe all the proceedings, if we even adopt them to the new law, the enemies of revolution would avoid punishment, and therefore terror is the instrument, it's the emanation of virtue, it's direct virtue, it's the embodied law, embodied virtue. He also says, and this is very important what he says, it is also, terror is also a way to impact the sensibility of the citizens, the morality of the citizens. As the terror practice is a bastard child, not even so much of enlightenment, but political sentimentalism. Terrorism is viewed, state terror is viewed by Jacobins as a means to affect the feelings of the citizens, their sensibility. And the third point, the third historical stage, which is quite important, is, of course, naturally, is Russian Revolution and Red Terror, the famous work of Leo Trotsky, Terror and Communism, which was in fact the answer to Kautsky's work, who in 1918, after the revolutionary events when Bolsheviks dispersed Russian Constituent Assembly and established terror as a state practice, as a revolutionary practice. The lists of the shot were published, the list of the hostages were published. It was a public act. It was a physical form of presentation of revolutionary violence. And Kautsky, in his work, accuses Trotsky and communists of betrayal of revolution, and they cannot be seen as the heirs to the age of enlightenment, because they dispersed the all-Russian Constituent Assembly, and they become usurpers of power. It's a forgotten word, but he formulates many arguments that in 1950s, 1960s, after the end of the personality cult, they were reproduced by anti-totalitarian lefts. And what Trotsky is answering, and I think it's quite important for understanding of the principles of the state terror, what Trotsky says about principles of revolutionary terror. He says that we are not going to try and justify ourselves. We are not going to speak just of red terror. There is white terror as well. We should understand not only the principles of red terror, we have to understand how red terror is different from the white one. And here Trotsky is giving a paradoxical formulation. It is not a question of legitimacy, he says, because both are illegitimate, because there is no central government and nobody can call for the state of emergency. The whites are pretending for power, but they are not the lawful government, and they cannot call for the state of emergency. So both forces are illegitimate, and it's not a question of purpose. The Russians and the Reds and the Whites are pursuing the same purpose, the oppression of the will of the opponent. They both use the same means. It's real politics, but they're both using violence. And this is not how red terror is different from the white one. And it's not quite a question of special sensibility or tolerance, or lack of them, as Trotsky accuses them of. And because, look, the whites are oppressing the enemy's propaganda on their territory. They are not allowing for social democrats to participate at the elections. So it's not a question of legitimacy, not a question of purposes or instruments or the fields of application of violence and representations of violence. So what's the difference between red and white terror? And I think this is the principal question here. The white terror is doomed, Trotsky says, in historical sense, because it's a terror of the descending class against the terror of the ascending class. And the ascending class is the one that is accelerating the historical process. So Trotsky is incorporating terror not in evolutionary scheme, but into a more fashionable scheme, as we like to speak about it now, into accelerating scheme. Red terror is a means to accelerate the progress. It is not more legitimate or less bloody or more tolerant, but because it is directed against the descending class, it helps progress, not just progress, but accelerating the progress. And Trotsky repeats Robespierre in the sense, it affects the morality of the citizens. We kill the thousands to frighten millions. And in some sense, it was just as guillotine was a humanist execution. For Trotsky, red terror was an alternative of Holocaust, total extermination. And Trotsky always says that in contradiction to the white terror, red terror should always be preventive. It should not be directed only at the act, but at the possibility of the act. And this work of Trotsky was published in 2007 in new edition, in new translation in Verso Publishers, with the introduction of Slavoj Žižek. And Žižek is saying there that this logic, Trotskyan logic, was adopted and reproduced by the American government within the discourse of anti-terrorist paradigm. He says that what we call the drone warfare, it is in a way, it is a violence that promotes what American government understands by progress and democracy. It's the idea of accelerating of the progress. I don't have enough time now. An important work by Grégoire Chamayou, The Theory of Drones, published in 2013, which I translated into Russian language, he shows how this discursive and semantic shift has taken place. A transition from what is called in 1960s anti-rebel doctrine, the idea that the right to revolt is a political question, and all the theoreticians of anti-rebel doctrine were saying that the class war, the revolt, it is always a war for population. And when this important semantic shift is taking place, I'm sorry, they're saying that the translator cannot cope quite, I'm too fast, I'm sorry. I will just pass to the conclusions. I'm passing to the conclusions. So, respectively, yeah, I have 5 minutes, right. The fourth stage of comprehension of state violence is the change of what was called an anti-rebel doctrine, which was formulated in a classical way by the French officer David Gallois, that in the beginning of the 1960s was fighting in Algiers. And this book, Anti-Rebel War, which explains that it's political war and a war for population, this anti-rebel war, and this anti-terroristic doctrine that, in the opinion of Chamayou, came in the late years, it eliminates the political element, and it, in a way, Chamayou says it's a problem of the state that is ruled by law rather than authoritarian state. Because as strange as it may seem, when administration of Obama came to power, it started to question the practices of anti-terroristic war in Guantanamo, of the special court-martials. But as a whole range of authors is showing, in a certain way, for the rule of law state, this war of extermination is easier. It has less juridical consequences. To preventively exterminate the terrorists for American administration, for American establishment, it is easier than to put them in Guantanamo with uncertain status, with the strange tribunals, court-martials that are taking place. And I'm coming to the conclusions as to comprehension of the state violence. And I think there are four important stages of comprehension of state violence and state terror. I think that, first and foremost, the problem of terror emerges in contradiction, as Agamben was writing about. There is a state of exception. It's a state of exception. It's a terra nulla between law and political practice. And this problem of terrorism became this nobody's land, terra nulla. And there are certain dead-end ways of discussing terrorism in legitimation or delegitimation of violence. Strange as it may seem, terrorism can never be reduced to the problem of excessive violence. Taking hostages is always a terroristic act. It doesn't have killing of the people or destroying of infrastructure for its main purpose. Secondly, the problem of terror can never be reduced to the problem of legitimization or delegitimization, because both sides finally come to the justification of violence that never needs to be justified. Those states of exception in which we cannot understand the juridical status of the operation. According to Trotsky, in a sense, they don't need to be justified. State actor, non-state actor are not searching for the justification of violence anymore. And therefore, the separation between state and non-state violence within the longer history context, it's not relevant, because the problems of terror are passing from state and non-state actors of violence to each other. It doesn't matter whether non-state actors are calling themselves terrorists or state calls themselves terror. The essence of their actions is not influenced by that. It stays the same. The third problem, of course, is the problem of depoliticization, when, as what Chamayou and many theoreticians of lately were talking about transition from politicization to depoliticization, the deviation from the classical European notion of the right to revolt, and the idea that the insurgents can represent, no matter what the ideas are, some deeper demands of the population. And as a counterbalance, I would like to make 5 points. We shouldn't forget a more productive way of discussing terror within the context of legitimization or delegitimization of violence. We shouldn't forget that terror is always a byproduct or a bastard child of Enlightenment's sentimentalism. It is always affecting feelings, and the problems of physical violence can be secondary. Secondly, we have to... The problem of terror within the civil society is always a problem of definition. not only in Russia, unfortunately, where we know that the kindred term extremism, which can encompass all sorts of political activities within itself. Unfortunately, this is not the problem of Russia only. Unfortunately, such tendencies can be seen in France, where we have a secular optics, where and that thus can bring many religious practices under the auspices of extremism. We could see in the United States where some parts of American establishments were seen as extremists. Of course, civil society is very interested in the most rigorous definition of terrorism, and of course it's a problem of institutes and institutional power, where we have such actors like FSB, CIA, etc. And I think that this fifth point is very important, that the whole range of theoreticians, partly Zizek, for example, they are saying that state terror is always a byproduct of progressism, the ideology of progress. But I don't think that it is quite true. I don't think that this is a correct posing of the problem, because we cannot step outside the discourse of some social progress and social movement. I think that the first and foremost, this is the problem of acceleration. The idea that we can, by using radical state violence, we can accelerate the progress. And this problem, which was observed by Robespierre and Trotsky, and the turning to the longer history context, can give us answers to the questions that are bothering us today. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you so much, colleagues. I suggest to start the discussion. Do you have any questions to the speaker? First and foremost, I turn to the participants of the conference. Raise your hands, those who want to ask a question. If everybody is thinking, I want to ask my own question, because this is an important topic, and I didn't understand everything correctly. But for me, the most important and key moment I heard was, and that has the saddest long-range effects, is the taking of terror outside of the ethical sphere. If French revolutionaries tried to see terror and view as virtue, and they had to prove that terror is being executed for the benefit of the people and freedom, etc., then the words of Trotsky that you adduce is a new step forward. Of course, Trotsky says this is, of course, illegal, but if it's viable, we can do without the ethical category. And this legitimation of violence in the mature modern society is built on absolute immoralism. And I think that this is an important moment. Perhaps I misunderstood you. The today's situation is it based on the same formula, that we're taking the ethical category outside any field of reference, and then we are having just rationalization of something, of violence. If we're taking totalitarian states, this is a separate story, but if we are talking about the states ruled by law, can we ignore the ethical element? Thank you so much for your question. I think that is quite a complex question. In a certain way, Trotsky affirms that there is this infamous, there is an old morality and a new morality, and the old morality that is based on the notions of the descending classes is not valid anymore, and the new morality of the builders of communism, it is the supreme morality, it's the supreme ethics. which helps us ignore what we traditionally call ethics in a certain way. And in that, Trotsky accuses Kautsky, because Kautsky calls himself a Marxist, but he doesn't understand the dialectic character of history, that in this process, in the process of confrontation of the classes, the old notions of ethics are not valid. But I think for Trotsky, what is most important is the question where history moves and who understands, who can influence this movement of history. And I think that within the context of revolution, the builders of communism, the revolutionaries, the participants of the Civil War, try to convince themselves that the logic of class confrontations, class struggle is the logic of history. And here comes the parallel that Zizek makes. He says that if we understand this logic, then we can make the projection, so to speak, from the notions of class struggle, of the ascendance of proletariat to communism, to the idea that we should install forcefully the democracy. In a certain sense, it is the supreme logic. I'm deducing Zizek's example. This is a supreme argument. And I think the problem here is that ethics and morality are being removed, not within the frames of revolutionary struggle. They are removed, just as in Marxism, within the highest idea of the social progress, which can be accelerated, that needs to be accelerated through the means of violence. And this violence would be always justified, according to Trotsky, on behalf of the state, because this violence leads to the development of the society. And I think that it's not so much a problem of means and ends, which is not specifically the problems of modern or specifically Soviet. I think that it is a problem of our idea that we can radically accelerate the social progress through the violent means, through the forceful means. And at that moment, we don't notice ourselves how we become Trotskyists, and the old morality is being removed, and we can see ourselves as the carriers of progress, as representations of progress. We are bringing the goods of civilization through the radical violence and ethical supremacy, and we can channel this process through the radical means to the desired ends. Yes, the idea of enforcing of progress is not specifically Trotsky's. All colonial wars were based on this. There is the idea of progress. We have developed civilization, and we are forcefully pushing barbarians to be civilized. And in this, I think so many points correspond. It is not they are not connected so much only to the left-wing terrorist thought, but this justification of violence through progress is a famous story, and this card is being played by so many different movements and strains of political life. But what interests me is another question. We can see in 2000s, when we had protests against war in Iraq, and many people, millions, were coming outside into the streets, that the new strain of thought, the idea of dismantling violence as the means of power, from that point of view, don't you see that there is a certain inner conflict between the society that doesn't want to recognize and accept violence as the system of state governance, And something that you describe as a quite traditional system of justification of state violence as the old system of means for solving complex tasks. Yes, of course there is a contradiction. But the aforementioned book of Chamayou, dedicated to the drone warfare, he shows there how the strategy of American establishment helps to low down the costs. And people are protesting not only against violence, they are protesting against the laws, human laws, against the violation of international law and enormous expenses. And the new strategy of using drones helps to avoid a colossal number of some such questions and to lower down the costs to the maximum. And respectively, because American elite has always in its subconscious this famous protest against the Vietnam War. And of course, this is the case, but the problem here is where exactly I started my speech. People are protesting, and in this way, they establish what Locke calls the right to revolt, the right to bring down the government. People are protesting, and if, for example, the Arab Revolution is taking place, Arabian Spring is taking place, then European public opinion is completely on the side of the revolutionaries. But on the other hand, the aftermath of these actions are hardly predictable, as we can see. There is a contradiction, and a contradiction on the level of the practice and on the level of the principles, because if we establish and confirm the right to revolt against the tyrannical government, the question is where we can draw the line. To which extent can the protest be taken? If people are just coming outside, can they occupy the buildings? Can they fight the policemen? And if the policemen are firing, can they answer back and arm themselves? In Myanmar, we can see that there is a whole army raised against the junta. It is always a question. The question of violence is structurally not determined and predetermined. Accepting the right of people to revolt and protesting against the war, we can indirectly provoke conflicts within the societies which we don't have any idea of how they function. The question is how we determine the line up to which we confirm the right to revolt, and where is the borderline where the state violence becomes legitimate or illegitimate. And this borderline is very flexible, is very vague, and it's hard to understand. And that's where the conflict of Kautsky and Trotsky came from. Kautsky thought that social democracy can win and come to power legally, and Trotsky was saying, no, you would never win in the contemporary condition through the elections. This is a question of, yes, we're speaking about the protest against violence and the dialectical process, as Marxists would put it. And indirectly, we are fully able to start the process of violence in the societies which we don't understand. And that's we have to formulate. Yes? Sorry? There are two questions here, and we don't have much time. The question from Tatiana Weiser: if in some conflict situation the two governments of different states that differently determine themselves in respect of state violence, for example, international conflict that presupposes of the activation of the involved sides, what can happen in this conflict interpretation? Is there any answer to that in the normative theory? Do you understand the question? there is a confrontation between the states that differently relate to using state violence. If there is an answer to that in normative theory, I think that the answer to that is that we have to determine for ourselves. Yes, we can answer through some quasi-progressivist terms. We can see that in this conflict, the victory of one of the sides will be investing in the future progress as we understand it, and the other side is not. There is no one answer from the point of view of some reflection. These are pragmatic questions. How we describe the participants of the conflict. For example, Israeli-Palestinian conflict. If we describe Israel as a modern state and Palestinian as an archaic state, archaic society, nationalism, religious fundamentalism, etc., then immediately we see, if we're using this description, we immediately understand the victory of which side in this conflict will be supportive of progress from our point of view. I think this is a problem of description, the problem of the general frame that we're giving to this. And one more question. Does the taking of the state terror outside the frame of ethical discourse mean that the other forms of political terror can be given the same standard? It's a good question. Yes, well, the purpose of every taking outside the ethical reference of state terror, well, I would say no, because the purpose of taking terror outside the ethical reference and legitimation of state's terror is always asymmetrical in respect of its idea of the actions of the other side. As Trotsky says, well, sorry, I'm always quoting it, but because I mentioned Trotsky all the time, state legitimating violence, even if it doesn't call it terror, it tries always to delegitimize this process, the actions of the other side, as directed towards the undermining of law and order. If the state is taking its own actions outside the ethical sphere, it doesn't mean that it would apply the same rules to the non-state actors, from my point of view. The purpose of the state is exactly this asymmetrization of the state and non-state actors. Frankly speaking, if we speak directly, it is the attempt of sacralization of power that is allowed to do things that nobody else is allowed to do. Yes, in a certain way, it's true. And the last question, what is the relations between the discourses of violence on behalf of the states and its concrete actions? Can we say that its actions are directly reflecting the state system, or there are certain incongruences between these two spheres? Well, it all depends, I think, on the concrete situation. We can easily imagine, and we can see this on examples of Arabian Spring, when initially the Western states were very supportive of the insurgents who were trying to bring down the government and express hope that those who revolt will bring down the government and establish democracy. But then the revolutionary process develops in an unexpected way and democracy doesn't come. But there is no way back. And we are beginning to use the principle of this least evil, like in Egypt, for example, when Muslim Brothers came to power, bringing down the old government, but then Muslim Brothers frightened everybody, and the military dictatorship came to power that used the same terroristic and illegal method, arrested the elected president, suppressed all the revolts, and West kept silent, obviously contradicting with its own rhetorics of that every change of power should be performed democratically, and the purpose is the democratic transformation of the society. But at a certain moment, they took a pragmatic decision that military dictatorship is better than Islamic government that would come to power through democratic elections. And we can see through this example that how official rhetorics of democratization of these societies, we can call them non-Western societies, comes into contradiction with political pragmatics, and there are so many examples that can be drawn. Thank you so much. I'm glad that we started the heated discussion, but I want to thank our speaker. Thank you so much, Evgeny.